He had the man in his sights. The Bren gun was up. The commander was right there, 10 feet away in the dark, and Gratien Fernando squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The gun jammed. In that single, mechanical instant. A spring that failed, a cartridge that didn't chamber. The fate of 30 men turned on a piece of metal smaller than a thumb. The commander would live. The mutiny would fail. And within 90 days, Gratien Fernando would stand before a firing squad in a Colombo prison, refusing a pardon, insisting he had done nothing wrong. He told his family, "Many years hence, the world may hear my story." This is that story. May 8, 1942, the Indian Ocean, an atoll so remote it barely appears on maps, a handful of soldiers, a cause they believed in with their lives, and a British Empire whose credibility had just been shattered into pieces. The Cocos Keeling Islands sit in the middle of the Indian Ocean, roughly halfway between the coasts of Sri Lanka and northwestern Australia. 2 coral atolls, a few square miles of land in total, inhabited by a few hundred Malay settlers, and by 1942, a garrison of British Commonwealth soldiers who had no great desire to be there. They weren't much to look at. Low-lying rings of sand and palm trees, barely above sea level, baking under an equatorial sun. The lagoons were beautiful if you had the luxury of noticing beauty. These men did not, but the islands mattered enormously to the British Empire. Running through the seafloor beneath Direction Island was an undersea telegraph cable, a physical wire connecting Britain to Australia, carrying military intelligence, government communications, war dispatches. Cut that cable, and you severed the Empire's nervous system in the southern hemisphere. And 2 6-inch naval guns sat on Horsburgh Island. If Japan wanted to dominate the central Indian Ocean, these islands would help them do it. The men of the Ceylon Garrison Artillery were volunteers. They had signed up in September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. Young Ceylonese men, many from Sinhalese Buddhist families, who had answered a call to serve the Empire. They came from Colombo and its suburbs. They were educated. They read newspapers and political pamphlets. Some had been touched by the ideas of a new political party, the Lanka Sama Samada Party, founded in 1935, the first organization in Ceylon to demand full independence from Britain. They weren't radicals in the usual sense. They were young men who believed in something, and they had been stationed, for months, on an isolated dot of coral in the middle of nowhere, under a British officer they had come to despise. To understand what happened on the Cocos Islands in May 1942, you have to understand what the previous 6 months had done to British prestige in Asia. It had destroyed it. On the 10th of December 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. 2 of Britain's most powerful warships, sent to deter Japanese aggression, were at the bottom of the South China Sea within 2 hours. Over 800 men died. Then came Singapore, the island fortress that the British had spent decades fortifying, the Gibraltar of the East. On the 15th of February, 1942, General Percival surrendered 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops to a Japanese force half their size. Churchill called it, privately but honestly, the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The myth of white British invincibility died at Singapore, and it didn't stop there. In April 1942, the Japanese Navy raided deep into the Indian Ocean. They sank the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes. They sank 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire. Their bombers struck Colombo and Trincomalee, cities in Ceylon itself. Japanese planes flew over Ceylon. Japanese ships operated freely in the waters around it. For a Ceylonese soldier stuck on a remote coral island, armed with artillery but no aircraft, no navy, and a commanding officer he didn't trust, the message was unmistakable. Britain was losing, and it might keep losing. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped Captain George Gardiner. Before the war, Gardiner had been an accountant for an export firm in Colombo. He had obtained an emergency war commission, the kind of rank the British Army handed out when they needed officers quickly, and couldn't be too particular about qualifications. He was not a natural soldier, and by most accounts, he was not a natural leader of men. The soldiers under his command had expected to be treated with dignity, as volunteers, as men who had chosen to serve, as human beings. What they received, according to those who were there, was contempt. The methods he used were, in the words of those who investigated the aftermath, widely hated. Relations between the men and their commanding officer had broken down completely. It was not just Gardiner. The institutional racism of British Imperial Command ran deep. The Civil Defense Commissioner of Ceylon, a senior official named Oliver Gunatillake, would later claim that Admiral Geoffrey Layton, the supreme British commander in Ceylon, had called him a black bastard during the crisis that followed. The soldiers of the CGA were fighting for an empire that did not consider them equals. His full name was Bombardier Gratien Fernando. He was born in 1915, the son of a superintendent at the Ceylon Telegraph Office, a middle-class Sinhalese Buddhist family with a tradition of quiet, competent service. Gratien Fernando was not quiet. He had read the LSSP pamphlets. He had argued with his officers, openly, at a time when that was dangerous. He had come to a conclusion that the men around him were slowly arriving at too, that fighting for Britain in 1942 was not fighting for freedom. It was fighting to preserve the chains. He held the rank of bombardier, a junior non-commissioned officer. Below him were gunners who, over months of isolation and resentment, had become ready to listen. His argument was simple. Asia was for Asiatics. The Japanese were winning. If they liberated Ceylon from British rule, that was a liberation worth having. The British Empire had nothing left to offer. He began to organize. The plan that Fernando put together was audacious, some would say delusional, given the resources at hand. But on paper it had a certain terrible logic. He had recruited 30 men, 30 of the 56 CGA soldiers on Horsburgh Island, slightly more than half. Enough if they moved fast. The plan had 4 steps. First, arrest Captain Gardiner and Lieutenant Stevens. Remove the British officers before they could respond. Second, disarm and neutralize the roughly 26 men who would remain loyal to the Crown. Third, turn the 2 6-inch coastal artillery guns on Direction Island, where the Ceylon light infantry were stationed with the cable station. Destroy the British forces there. Sever communications. Fourth, signal the Japanese on Christmas Island, 900 miles away. Tell them the Cocos Islands were theirs. After that, Fernando believed, Japanese forces would arrive, Ceylon would be liberated, and the mutineers would be remembered as the men who struck the first blow for independence. He also surrendered on a condition, one that reveals how deeply he understood his own situation. He reportedly told his captors he would lay down his arms only if he was tried in Colombo. He intended to speak from the dock. He intended to make his trial a moment that Ceylon would not forget. Nightfall on May 8, 1942. The Indian Ocean was dark beyond the reef. The Coral Island was quiet. The guns on Horsburgh Island stood cold and ready on their emplacements. Fernando gave the signal. 30 men moved. For a moment, a few seconds, perhaps a minute, the mutiny was actually happening. Then the shooting started. The mutineers, trained artillerymen, were poor shots with small arms. Artillery pieces are aimed by calculation and machinery. A rifle is aimed by a man's hands. The CGA soldiers had not been trained as infantrymen. In the chaos of the firefight, their marksmanship failed them. Gunner Samaras Jayasekara, one of the mutineers, was shot and killed. Lieutenant Stevens, Gardiner's deputy, was wounded. But Gardiner himself was untouched. And then came the moment everything turned on. Fernando raised the Bren gun. Captain Gardiner was in his sights. The Bren was the mutineers' only automatic weapon, a .303 caliber light machine gun capable of firing 500 rounds a minute. At close range, in the hands of a man who meant it, it was decisive. Fernando meant it. He fired. The gun jammed. A mechanical failure that lasted less than a second changed everything. The spring didn't release. The bolt didn't cycle. The cartridge sat in the chamber, inert. Gardiner was alive. Fernando stood there, in the dark, with a weapon that wouldn't fire and 30 men who had just committed treason on his word, and he had to decide what to do next. The mutineers tried to reach the 6-inch guns, They tried to turn the artillery toward Direction Island, but the loyal soldiers and the Ceylon light infantry who had not joined the revolt overpowered them. It was over. If the Cocos Islands Mutiny, the forgotten revolt that shook the British Empire, fascinate you, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We drop a new story every single week. Now, back to the Cocos Islands Mutiny, the forgotten revolt that shook the British Empire. Fernando surrendered, but on his own terms, or what he told himself were his own terms. He declared he would lay down his arms only on the condition that he be tried in Colombo. Not on this island, not in a military courtroom 3,000 miles from Ceylon. In Colombo, in front of his people. He wanted a stage. He believed, and this tells you everything about the man, that if he could speak from a dock in Ceylon, he could turn a failed mutiny into something that would outlast him. He was partially right. 15 mutineers were court-martialed on the Cocos Islands. The presiding officer was Captain George Gardiner, the man whose life Fernando had tried to take, the man whose command style had contributed to the conditions that produced the mutiny. He sat in judgment over the men who had tried to kill him. Historians would later note that haste and procedural flaws weakened the authorities' case, that Gardiner's presence as presiding officer was a profound conflict of interest. The trial was conducted quickly, with what critics called self-serving evidence from the commanding officer himself. 7 men were sentenced to death. 4 sentences were commuted. 3 were not. Back in Ceylon, people fought for the condemned men's lives. Families appealed to Oliver Gunatilica, the Civil Defense Commissioner. Members of the State Council, H.W. Amarasuria and Susantha de Fonseca, went directly to the governor, Sir Andrew Caldecott, and to Admiral Leighton himself. All of them failed. Fernando was offered clemency. He refused it. He told his family, "I'll never ask a pardon from the British. That would disgrace the cause." And then he said the words he wanted to be remembered. "Many years hence, the world may hear my story." On the 5th of August, 1942, 89 days after the mutiny, Bombardier Gratien Fernando was executed at Wellicata prison in Colombo. His last recorded words were these: "Loyalty to a country under the heel of a white man is disloyalty." On the 7th of August, Gunner Carlo Augustus Gowder was executed. On the 8th, Gunner G. Benny da Silva. 3 consecutive days, 3 men, 3 executions. They were the only British Commonwealth servicemen executed for mutiny in the entire Second World War. Gunner Samaras Jayasekara, the young mutineer who had been killed in the fighting, was buried with full military honors on Horsburgh Island, later reinterred at the Kranji War Memorial in Singapore, among the Empire's honored dead. His comrades who had killed him were denied even the medals they had earned. The British response to the mutiny was instructive. First, they tried to bury it. The military classified as much as possible. The story was kept from the Ceylonese public. The veterans who returned from the Cocos Islands in December 1942 found their promotions suspended and their campaign medals withheld. Second, they never again trusted Ceylonese soldiers in a combat role. No regiment of the Fighting Arms was deployed after the mutiny. The message was clear: these men cannot be relied upon. Third, and this is the military calculation that reveals most, they reinforced Ceylon's defenses to 3 full British Army divisions. They instituted rationing to keep Ceylonese civilians comparatively well-fed, explicitly to prevent further disaffection. They were managing a subject population they no longer fully controlled. The Empire was conducting damage control. Fernando had been right about one thing. The LSSP, the Lanka Sama Samaja Party, incorporated the Cocos Islands mutiny into its anti-colonial rhetoric. The 3 executions became symbols, men who died for Ceylon's freedom. The story circulated in whispers, in political meetings, in pamphlets. The British had tried to suppress it. The story spread anyway. On the 4th of February, 1948, 5 years and 6 months after Gratien Fernando walked to his execution, Ceylon became an independent nation. He never saw it. He had predicted it from his prison cell, defiant, refusing the pardon that might have saved him. Many years hence, the world may hear my story. He had been 27 years old. The Cocos Islands Mutiny has almost no place in the standard histories of the Second World War. The British, for obvious reasons, had no interest in celebrating it. The official record was classified. The veterans were denied their medals. For decades, this story existed mainly in the memory of families, in obscure academic journals, and in a single book, Noel Cruss's The Cocos Islands Mutiny, published in 2001 after years of painstaking archival research. Think about what that means. 30 men on a coral island in the Indian Ocean took up arms against an empire, not in the name of chaos, not out of cowardice, but in the name of self-determination. They failed. Their leader was shot at dawn in a prison courtyard, and the empire that killed him tried to make sure no one would ever find out. But here we are. What do we make of Gratien Fernando? He sided with Japan, an empire pursuing its own brutal colonial project across Asia, committing atrocities in China, in Korea, and the Philippines. His judgment that Japanese victory would bring Ceylonese liberation was, at best, naive. But his diagnosis of British colonialism was not wrong. The men under Captain Gardiner had been treated as tools of empire rather than citizens with dignity. The fall of Singapore had stripped away the ideological cover, the claim that British rule meant security, meant protection, meant civilization. By May 1942, that argument lay at the bottom of the South China Sea with HMS Repulse. Fernando and his men were not simply soldiers who mutinied. They were the political consequences of empire, of a system that recruited men to fight for a freedom it had no intention of sharing with them. Gratien Fernando was executed at 27. Ceylon was free at 33. He didn't live to see it, but he died certain he was right. If this story found you, if you're watching this on a screen somewhere in the world, decades after 3 men were executed on a coral island at the edge of an ocean, then Gratien Fernando was right. The world did hear his story, eventually.